Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope you are all excited about what you've been learning and you've had a lot of good conversations with other students and social workers in the field. This is our afternoon keynote. Reproductive rights are human rights, and it's all about the current working and campaigns around reproductive justice here in Michigan. On today's keynote, we have Nicole Stallworth, who is the Executive Director of the Planned Parenthood Advocacy of Michigan, and Merissa Kovach, who is the Legislative Director of the ACLU-Michigan. First up, we have Merissa, who is going to have a short presentation for us.
Thank you so much, Melina. I am going to start by by sharing my screen here so I can put up some slides for those of you who are visual learners here. So I'm going to start by laying the groundwork, and then I'm going to kick it over to my counterpart and my partner in so much of this work, Nicole Stallworth over at Planned Parenthood. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the history of reproductive rights and abortion rights has looked like in Michigan, what that means currently for the state landscape, the national landscape, and then what led us to some of the work that the ACLU-Michigan and Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan and our coalition partners are doing right now, which includes the Reproductive Freedom for All ballot initiative and some lawsuits, and just all of the tools that we're using right now at our disposal to protect these fundamental rights in the state. So just jumping right into it, we're at a really pivotal moment in this country. We're now experiencing, in the last several months, the Supreme Court made a very quick decision to roll back rights that we have had to making our own private healthcare decisions about our pregnancies for over 50 years. The reality is that we had been seeing that as a trajectory that we had been moving on for quite some time over the last 10 years. So I'll talk a bit about that, but jumping into immediately what happened in this last year that really flipped the script, and that right now we are really using everything within our power to confront and tackle. So in May of last year, the Supreme Court agreed to take a case. This is that Dobbs case that was decided in June. This was a case out of Mississippi that Mississippi brought as a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade. This is when many of us knew, who have been working within this area for quite some time, that the writing truly was on the wall, and that this signaled that the Supreme Court was at a minimum willing to entertain overturning Roe v. Wade. That Dobbs decision did come down in June. We had some signals along the way, such as that leak in May that of the Supreme Court decision that the Supreme Court was poised to overturn Roe v. Wade. And then in September of 2021, when ultimately the Supreme Court turned its back on enforcing an abortion ban in Texas, which ultimately meant that they were turning their back on Roe and that 50 years of precedent that we have had in this country where the right to an abortion has been federally protected. What this ultimately means is over 50% of our population is expected to eventually lose access to the right to abortion in their home state. And we've already seen that this decision has had really tragic and deadly consequences for women across the country. And that harm is falling hardest on Black women and women of color who were already facing a maternal mortality crisis. And that this crisis has become more severe in states that were already determined to ban abortion. In Michigan, in particular, where we're not immune to this, we are in a kind of pivotal state right now. We have a ban on the books that bans virtually all abortion. That could go into effect at any time. At the moment, it's been held at bay. We've been able to maintain our rights in the status quo in the wake of Roe being overturned because of some lawsuits that have challenged the constitutionality of the 1931 law under the Michigan Constitution, but we do still have this law in the books that could go back into effect, and it would make abortion illegal for almost all cases, with a very narrow exception for the life of the mother, and it could threaten doctors with prison for up to 15 years for providing abortion care. The law also has some scary privacy measures in place too, that if a pharmacy sells abortion medication, they would be forced to record the name of a patient, prescription information, and the name and address of their doctor on a registry. So this is really at the crossroads of medical privacy as well, and going down this where we're much further down what I would call a slippery slope. Where I mentioned earlier that over 50% of our country's population is in a position where they will likely be residing in a place where they do not have the right to access abortion. Michigan, because of this 1931 law, is one of 26 states that has or is poised to lose this access now that Roe is overturned. If that were to be the case, abortion would be criminalized in Michigan, and the closest access points for care will likely be Illinois and New York State, and for the Upper Peninsula, possibly Minnesota as well. But how did we get to this place? Because I mentioned that 50% of the country may not have access in their home state to abortion care. And when we talk about the right to abortion or the right to reproductive health care or any health care in general, legality isn't enough. The rights that we had under Roe v. Wade, that was really what we were looking at as the floor. That was protecting the legal right to be able to have that medical care. But without being able to access that medical care, that right is really fraught, and the realization of having those rights can't fully be realized. And many people in this country, many people in this state have never truly had access to the health care that they need, and the right to abortion, and being able to access reproductive health care in this state. We have a web of barriers that pregnant people who are in need of abortion need to go through in order to access the care they need. And these restrictions have only increased in the last 10 years. So I mentioned earlier when I started talking that for those of us who have been working in reproductive rights, that we started seeing the signs that we were going on this trajectory of Roe being overturned many years ago. It was about 10 years ago, in 2011, that we started to see a wave of abortion bans and more extreme restrictions to accessing abortion care proliferate around the country and proliferate in state legislatures across the country. And many states became these battleground states where the line was being pushed further and further. And over the course of about a decade, we saw over 500 abortion bans and restrictions introduced in state legislatures across the country. And it's been pretty relentless, and Michigan hasn't been immune to that. We've been more fortunate than other states, but that has oftentimes been because of luck, because we have had leaders in office who have been in key positions who have been able to protect these rights at all levels of government. So we've been very fortunate in Michigan, but that doesn't mean that we don't also have restrictions. So to give you a sense of what patients currently in Michigan have to go through in order to access this care before what happened with the Supreme Court earlier this year, patients who are in need of an abortion have to receive biased, oftentimes medically inaccurate information that's written by the state in a counseling process. There is a 24-hour waiting period from the time a patient seeks to obtain an abortion, where they have to then receive that biased state-written information before they can get the care that they need. This is essentially a state-mandated timeout. There are restrictions in Michigan. There are physician-only restrictions in Michigan, and which means that despite qualifications of advanced practice clinicians, like physician's assistants, nurse practitioners who are licensed to practice medicine, they are prohibited from providing this care. And this is a restriction that carries no medical weight. It's really it's really there to decrease access. And again, going back to that point that if you don't have access to a right, that right is really a right in name only, which is why when we talk about the right to reproductive health care, the right to abortion, or any form of health care, we really have to focus on how policy also affects access to those rights as well and to that care that we need. Other restrictions are in place there are expensive, medically unnecessary, onerous restrictions on healthcare facilities that provide abortions, requiring them to meet guidelines and regulations that are not medically necessary, but are incredibly expensive. These are for the sole purpose of making it prohibitively expensive to provide abortion care, to provide reproductive health care. They serve no medical purpose. We also call these sometimes trap laws, targeted regulations against abortion providers. This has been a very common threat to the right to abortion that we've seen across the country because it goes directly at the heart of access. If you can't, again, as I keep harping on, if you can't access a right, if you can't access the care you need, it really doesn't, having the right to that care is pretty empty. We also have a ban in Michigan on your private insurance coverage for abortion. Again, something that serves no medical purpose. This is your own personal insurance that you buy with your own money or that is provided to you from your employer. Any private insurance is prohibited from providing abortion care within the standard services. You have to purchase a separate rider in order to get that care. Again, a policy that passed recently in fairly recent time in 2014 that is meant solely to make it more cost prohibitive for someone who is in need of an abortion to be able to afford to get one. And then there are also some unnecessary barriers to accessing abortion care through telemedicine and medication abortion through telemedicine. So really what this is all meant to paint a picture of is that there's webs of restrictions, and some of these have passed in recent time, and this has been what we've been up against, where we have constantly in Michigan been playing whack-a-mole for a good 10-15 years, where we are constantly just rolling back access and the right to this important health care without being able to proactively expand access or fight for these rights proactively. And I think that's going to lead me to where I talked briefly about what has led us to some of the current strategies that we're looking at and why we have taken now a more proactive posture in protecting these rights. But before I do, I also want to make note of another trend that we have seen over the last 10 years that we only expect to get worse now that there is no federal right to protecting the right to abortion in Michigan. And that's the criminalization of pregnancy. That's punishing pregnant individuals for actions that may be interpreted as harmful to their own pregnancies. This includes enforcement of laws that might punish different actions during pregnancy that would not otherwise be criminal or punishable. And I think this is important, especially for all of you as social workers as well, because this goes at the intersection of the criminal legal system and healthcare as well, and how pregnant individuals, particularly and disproportionately Black women and women of color who are pregnant, are targeted with these new criminal measures. And what this trend has begun doing is creating a new class of crime victims, and that would be a fetus, and creating a crime, establishing that as a crime victim, which essentially sets up pregnant women as being it sets them up as being targets if they, for example, and being over criminalized. So what we see is women being targeted or surveyed in the healthcare when they're receiving healthcare, and being targeted and tested without their knowledge for substance use during pregnancy. Seeing that a woman who may commit a crime while pregnant, that she could face harsher penalties simply because she is pregnant. And the general policing of pregnant women and pregnant people in a way that is setting is set. This is essentially setting up that the real threat that we used to face before Roe was folks needing to was the back alley abortion, which we often hear as being the greatest threat. And now jump 50 years later, one of the greatest threats now that Roe is no longer intact is that, and with a shift to and the growing mass incarceration in this country, that the criminalization of pregnancy is one of the greatest threats that we are seeing right now. And even though Michigan currently has protections, even though Michigan hopefully will have stronger protections by the end of the year, that when we see the rollback of reproductive rights, when we see the rollback of the right to abortion, we start to see heightened surveillance of pregnant people, heightened criminalization of pregnant people. And this is really something to keep our eyes on now and try to combat at every single point that we can. I will just very briefly talk about, because I know I've painted a bit of a dire picture about what Michigan looks like in the landscape and what the country looks like right now. I think I can say, like, for anyone who's feeling concerned about this, rest assured a bit, there have been people who have been working really hard behind the scenes to try to ensure that these rights in Michigan won't go away. We have been contemplating and working at trying to figure out every single tool that we have at our disposal to make sure that our legal rights don't go away in this state as they have in other states across the country. So I'm going to jump a little bit into talking about the ballot initiative, and then I'm going to pass it to Nicole to really kind of dive into what the ballot initiative is and some of the other strategies that we've been looking at. But beginning early last year, like I said, we started to see the writing on the wall, and this is before the Dobbs decision was taken by the Supreme Court. But we began having conversations with stakeholders in Michigan to identify how can we finally take a proactive posture to protect our legal rights in Michigan, and maybe give us a springboard to also address our access issue in Michigan as well. And how can we start to build a state that where not only do we have the right to abortion, the right to make our own decisions about our pregnancies and our reproductive health care, but where we can actually start to work on ensuring that there is equity in accessing that care as well. So our partners and the ACLU began having a listening tour in early 2021. We talked with social justice advocates some who were not traditionally reproductive rights social justice advocates, who had expertise in economic justice, criminal legal reform, immigration rights. We spoke with medical professionals that provide abortion care, legal scholars across the state, and stakeholders. And these stakeholders really agreed that what the next move would be to try to pass a constitutional amendment in Michigan that was akin to Roe v. Wade and the constitutional rights that we've had in Michigan across the country for over 50 years. And that would be the most definitive way to protect and expand access to abortion and reproductive freedom in Michigan that we could take on. So we took on this strategy, realizing that was more protective than going the route of trying to pass legislation. It would help limit the ability of anti-abortion organizations or an anti-abortion legislative majority to intervene in the process, and would ensure that we could also protect more than just abortion, recognizing that there's a full spectrum of reproductive health care and reproductive health needs that folks need throughout their lifetime. And that includes that we were able to protect not just the right to abortion, but also contraception, sterilization, pre and postnatal care, infertility care, miscarriage management, and all of that. And then this would also allow us, where I painted a picture of those webs, that web of restrictions that folks have to access already to get the care that they need, help us start addressing those restrictions that are medically unnecessary, that are only there to serve to create barriers for folks accessing the healthcare they need. So that gives you a bit of what the landscape is, what things are looking like across the country, and just some of the groundwork that we laid to bring us to where we are in present day and what we're dealing with and the strategies that we have taken on. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, and I think I am kicking it over to Nicole now to present.
Thank you so much, Merissa. That was a fabulous and in-depth description of background, which I think is really important for everyone to sort of understand why we felt like there was such a need for Proposal 3. I'm going to also share my screen and slide deck so that I can sort of share some information about what we're doing at Planned Parenthood to partner with ACLU, but also to sort of support Proposal 3 and also provide some details about what Proposal 3 is and does. So thank you so much. As expressed, I'm the executive director for Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan and also the vice president for public advocacy at Planned Parenthood of Michigan, which is our C3 arm. It's very important that I just always want to take an opportunity to explain to everyone. Planned Parenthood is a health center. We provide sexual and reproductive health care services, including abortion, to the traditionally underserved people that typically may be underinsured or maybe have to navigate some of those barriers that Merissa talked about earlier. And so Planned Parenthood Advocates is a C4 organization that really provides all of the advocacy work a little bit deeper than what our C3 organization is able to provide. And our mission within this organization is to protect and ensure and enhance the ability of Planned Parenthood of Michigan to provide the healthcare services that we provide. And we do that through movement building, advocacy, and our electoral programs. So Merissa sort of talked a lot about, the background and why this coalition needed to come together to address some of the challenges that we were facing, knowing and that we were seeing the writing on the wall around the Supreme Court's agreement to take up the Dobbs case and then their lack of action in the Texas abortion ban case, just sort of knowing that, hey, we have a real threat here in Michigan and we need to be prepared. So a couple of things that we did at Planned Parenthood was similar to what Merissa talked about. We participated in their listening tour as an organization, and it's been part of the coalition since the beginning. But Planned Parenthood itself also decided to do a number of things. So we explored litigation, and Michigan is one of the rare states that abortion is still legal due to the litigation that went forward, not only in Planned Parenthood's lawsuit against the state of Michigan Attorney General, but also in the governor's lawsuit that she brought in the Oakland County Circuit Court. So we received a permanent injunction issued in September of 2022. I think it's also very important to note and to underscore that this injunction was issued in the Michigan Court of Claims. Just a little legal nuance, friends, for those of us that don't live and breathe this work every day. The Michigan Court of Claims is not the highest court. And so it's important to understand that this decision is basically highly subject to appeal and another decision by a higher court, because the Court of Claims is not the highest court. But another part of our strategy, so that's that. And we're very appreciative of that injunction because it's keeping patients safe and it's keeping doctors able to practice medicine. Another part of our strategy is to elect pro-choice candidates at every level of government. We can do that in our C4 work. And then finally, the vote yes on Proposal 3, which is the constitutional amendment for reproductive freedom. And I just also want to just underscore that, as Merissa talked about, we have this very harsh 1931 law that that is still out there. And the other thing that I think is important to note about this law, even though it's being blocked by the courts for now, it still exists. It hasn't been repealed, even though there have been many opportunities for the legislature in different sessions to repeal this law. There has been no action. There has been no one has really taken, no legislative leadership has taken the opportunity to repeal this particular law. So it still exists on our books. So I want to sort of talk to you about what do we do about that and what we've decided to do. And Merissa sort of did a great job of laying the foundation in the background and really helping to understand that what we decided to do was to form, in coalition together, was to form this campaign, the Reproductive Freedom for All campaign. And we filed our campaign articles of incorporation per se in January of 2022. And we did that based on all the things that Merissa had laid out in her previous slides around talking with stakeholders, really understanding the writing is on the wall here, knowing that, there's a threat that exists for us. And ACLU-Michigan, Planned Parenthood Advocates of Michigan, and Michigan Voices, which is a coalition member-based organization of BIPOC-led reproductive justice leaders and advocates, came together to form the Reproductive Freedom for All campaign in order to begin our process of circulating petitions and going through the process with the Michigan Board of State Canvassers to qualify for the November ballot. And so that happened in January of 2022. This was pre-leak. And we did this in January. In April of 2022, Planned Parenthood filed its lawsuit. On the same day, Governor Whitmer filed her lawsuit. In May of 2022, we know that someone decided that it was a good idea to leak a draft opinion about what the United States Supreme Court was preparing to do. And then we know that in June, they actually went forward with those plans and much of what was in that draft leaked opinion and reversed Roe v. Wade. This was the first time that the United States Supreme Court had ever reversed a right that they had previously affirmed. These are the leaders of our campaign coalition by face. Lauren Kogali is the executive director at ACLU-Michigan. Also, Merissa's colleague. Merissa's very much has been part of the construction of not only the proposal, but all of the actions and activities with the ballot question committee, myself, and Summer Foster, who's one of the executive directors of Michigan Voices. So I sort of walked through this, but this is a slide which talks about everything step by step that the Court of Claims did step in and rule that the 1931 law was unconstitutional. But again, as I mentioned, this is one of the lower courts, and this decision is highly subject to appeal. The governor did receive a preliminary injunction in her case in the Michigan Oakland County Circuit Court, but she has been rallying for the Michigan Supreme Court to take up that case as well. Not sure what's going to happen in that. And so again, I think we're at a critical point in history where we know and understand that there is this 90-year felony abortion ban on our books that needs to be addressed and dealt with, as well as doctors and patients and citizens and voters need to understand and know for sure what their options will be. And so this Reproductive Freedom for All ballot question will protect reproductive freedom in the Michigan Constitution, no matter who the governor is, who the state attorney general is, who's in the Michigan legislature, who's leading all of those bodies of government that that shift at every election cycle. This was really want to talk about some of the things that the proposal does. I talked about we filed the campaign in January, and we also developed a policy which it turned into the Reproductive Freedom for All amendment that would do the following things. And understanding that Roe v. Wade was going to be reversed, we wanted to make sure that we were restoring the rights and protections that we had under Roe v. Wade. For nearly 50 years. And we wanted to also make sure that we were blocking that 1931 law from being able to be enforced. Also ensuring that all doctors have all options available to them in order to save lives. And keeping the decision about abortion and pregnancy in the hands of the person who is carrying the pregnancy and their doctor, not politicians. So there are three main components of what this policy is and does. Number one, it restores the rights to an abortion. This is something that was upheld and protected under Roe v. Wade. And so, I mean, I think it's been argued that that this 1931 criminal abortion ban has not been reversed because we had Roe v. Wade, and there may be some truth to that. But as Merissa said, there's been signs for nearly the last 10 years around the threat and the agenda to most certainly overturn Roe v. Wade. So this is really important that we make sure that we restore the right to an abortion and make that known and make that clear that it is a part of our constitutional right. It also protects access to reproductive health care. So this includes things like birth control, prenatal care, and childbirth. The reason that this is really important is that when the United States Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade, one of the justices, Justice Thomas, cited three cases that had to do with a person being able to access birth control, also marriage equality. All of those three cases were rooted in marital privacy and your right to privacy. So long way of saying, and a legal way of saying that reproductive health care includes access to all of these things without interference, and it keeps the decision around the treatments in these areas between the doctor and the person who is looking for the medical care. And then it also ensures equity and access to reproductive health care. So again, to reference the excellent foundation and backdrop that Merissa provided about the barriers that people have to navigate in order to receive equitable access to healthcare are numerous. And we needed to make sure that Proposal 3 addressed that, and it just prevents discrimination for anybody trying to access their inherent right through Proposal 3. So the systemic impacts that this will have is that it will block this 1931 criminal abortion ban, and it will keep the state and any bad actor, pundits who think that, who really value being able to regulate women's bodies and people who can become pregnant bodies out of the medical office, and more importantly, out of the medical decisions. And it forces medical professionals. I mean, it basically prohibits this 1931 law, which forces medical professionals to consider threats to their licensure and prevents medical doctors from being able to practice and treat their patients based upon what their needs are. It prevents that law, again, from going into effect. So in essence, this proposal will ensure that Michigan women and all people who can become pregnant or are pregnant capable have the freedom to make their decisions about abortion instead of having politicians decide for them. It trusts women to make the decisions that's best for their bodies and lives. Just based on the inherent value that everybody that, these are basic human rights, and these are rights that everyone deserves to be able to have control of their bodies. And it also ensures that no one can be punished for their pregnancy outcomes, such as miscarriage, stillbirth, or abortion. There's a little piece of this 1931 criminal abortion ban that also cites that anyone who assists someone, the language says procuring a miscarriage. So anyone, we just wanted to make certain that any part of that law, which was written in 1931, was able to be blocked. And so that is the way in which this proposal was developed and constructed. This is the language that appears on the ballot. It basically outlines all of the particulars that I just went through, and voters will be asked to adopt this by ovaling in the yes here. So I am going to stop here and bring my colleague Merissa back on. I think we are going to have a Q&A, and thank you everyone for taking the time to learn about our proposal and what we've been up to.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing and presenting. I just want to take a minute to read a little portion from Social Work Speaks, which is our policy guide that was created by NASW. So this relates to the NASW Code of Ethics and Reproductive Justice. Our Code of Ethics states that social workers respect and promote the right of clients to self-determination and assist clients in their efforts to identify and clarify their goals. Self-determination related to reproductive health means that without government interference or reproductive coercion by an intimate partner, friend, family member, or professional, people should make their own decisions about sexual activity and reproduction. As social workers, we support the right of individuals to decide for themselves without duress and according to their own personal beliefs and convictions. And our NASW policy statement, which is nationally and statewide, is that we support public health campaigns that attempt to destigmatize abortion and other reproductive services while providing evidence-based information so that each person has a solid foundation to base their decision. And so there was, that's that. And I just wanted to say that NASW-Michigan has endorsed voting yes on Proposition 3. And so that is something that we've already done. And so we are happy that you provided a little bit more information on that. And I know there's a question that I had planned on asking you, but came up in the chat too, is how do you talk about and address the misinformation that's happening around Proposal 3?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I probably could have gone into a slide deck about that. I think at the end of the day, what we need to really, I did go through all of the things that Proposal 3 does. And I think that it's important to note that if it wasn't on the list of what we provided, or if it's not included in the list that is on your ballot, it does not do that. I want to walk you guys a little bit through our process of what we had to do in order to get this on the ballot. The process is not that we can come up with a policy and then it automatically appears on the ballot. We actually had to submit language and this policy to a bipartisan board. Even though it's a bipartisan board, it has political figures on it. And so this group had to agree to put this on the ballot by voting. And also they went through the language and allowed and basically approved the language that is appearing on our ballot. So it can be assumed that this information is accurate and truthful because it's gone through several steps of vetting. So we did that, I think the first time was in February. We came back to them again in March. And that was the language that was going to appear on the petition. That is also part of that, what appeared on the petition, also it appears on our ballot. And then again in September, we had to have the language that would appear on the ballot approved by the State Board of Canvassers. They did deadlock for a reason, not because they felt like for a reason that had nothing to do with the language that was on the ballot. And so the Michigan Supreme Court ruled that the proposal should go on the Michigan ballot. I say all that to say that what appears on the ballot is an accurate reflection of what the proposal is and does. The other components are just flat lies, because we know that there are people who oppose making abortion legal. And what those efforts are, what's happening now is that you're seeing that they're doing and saying anything to try to make this conversation and to try to make this about everything that it is not. And the reality is that the United States Supreme Court unfortunately reversed Roe v. Wade. And we don't have assurances that Michigan voters will have access and protections for themselves and their families, and for anybody that may need an abortion, that we don't have assurances that we have that anymore. The second component, I raised this in my presentation, is that this 1931 law is still on the books. It hasn't been repealed. There's been multiple opportunities, multiple bills introduced to repeal this law. The legislative leadership has declined to take these bills up and vote on them. So it hasn't been repealed, it still exists. And I'm going to just turn it over to Merissa to see if you have anything else to add. But we really want to make sure, that's why we do things like this, because we want to make sure that people are educated about what this proposal is and does.
Yeah, I think Nicole covered it really beautifully and comprehensively. I think the only point I would drive home, because the question does ask about the too confusing, too extreme narrative, and that there's a lot of inflammatory claims about what this would do floating around there. I mean, as Nicole laid out, at its core, this protects the rights that we had for 50 years. This codifies Supreme Court precedent that we had under Roe v. Wade and some subsequent Supreme Court cases that protected these rights at the federal level. This is doing that at the state level. And this amendment very explicitly lays out that the legislature has a right to regulate abortion care, as they do in all forms of health care. That if they're doing so, it needs to be in the delivery and the service of protecting patient health, following best standards of medical care, and really just solidifying that abortion is healthcare and it needs to be treated that way, and it can't be marginalized in the way that the legislature has done, where it's marginalized it from other forms of healthcare. So as with any constitutional amendment, it is fully within the realm and the responsibility of the legislature and the courts to define what this means and define what implementation looks like. This is establishing the fundamental right that we have that right, and all rights do have limitations, and that is what the next step would be. If reproductive freedom for all is passed, that we look at what that implementation looks like and what those laws are around the delivery of that health care.
That leads great into my next question. I was going to ask, what is the next step if Prop 3 passes in November? Do we have that planned yet? Are there coalitions forming, I assume?
I mean, I think the next steps are then to look at where, it gives us the protections that we need, but we know that we still need to stay vigilant, and we need to be able to ensure that access is then protected. I talked a lot about access and what can we then do to ensure that some of the barriers that folks face in this state before Roe was overturned, that they're currently facing, how can we address that so that abortion care is treated much more truly like the health care that it is, and remove some of those barriers that are in place. And I think, as Nicole mentioned, there is the lawsuit, and what we've been committed to from the beginning is using every single tool available to us in our tool belt. So ensuring that that lawsuit remains successful is something I know Planned Parenthood will remain committed to doing, so that we can actually have even an even stronger basis in reproductive freedom for all, that 1931 law is unconstitutional. And then we'll be looking at legislation too. Planned Parenthood and ACLU work in the Michigan legislature to pass policy that protects reproductive health care and expands access to. And Nicole mentioned that for the last several sessions, there's been legislation that has been introduced that we've worked closely with sponsors on, that protects the right to abortion and reproductive health care, and also addresses some of those barriers directly. And that will remain an important strategy as well, because those laws can are much more detailed and state how that delivery of healthcare will look like. So the Reproductive Freedom for All Amendment said it's one of the most enduring, strongest protections we can have. But the lawsuits, passing legislation still that can really get at the struggle for access that we have in the state is going to remain still incredibly important. And that's what we'll be really focusing our attention on as well.
Great. And then I don't want to think negatively, but what are the next steps if it doesn't pass?
Yeah, I think Merissa laid out much of that, is that, we're really going to be working to advocate that our court cases are successful. Once a lawsuit is filed, that's all left in the hands of the court and the judicial system. So just sort of watching that closely and just making sure our attorneys are on top of everything, any challenge that comes up in court, in any appeals, any requests for appeal, that we are doing all of the things that we need to be doing to make sure that our attorneys are responding to those things. But the other component and piece of that, I think, is the reality that, we have to look at how we got here, to understand what happens if Proposal 3 doesn't pass. And how we got here is that there have been elected officials who have failed to repeal this 1931 criminal abortion ban, which I said is still a big threat. And we know that about a third of the country has lost complete access to their bodily autonomy under Roe v. Wade, that was upheld under Roe v. Wade. So, I don't want to paint a dark picture either, but hey, I was given this world, I didn't make it. And it's truly unfortunate that this is where we are right now in Michigan. And there's a real threat that we could be criminalized for having an abortion. There's a real threat that doctors may be punished by a felony for providing an abortion. And then the question marks are all up in the air about what does it mean to provide someone information about where to find an abortion? What does it mean to help them search the internet in order to provide an abortion, in order for them to find a safe abortion provider? So these are all the things that this is real, this is happening right now, that people are having to navigate in other states where they've completely lost access to an abortion. And much of it is dependent on who is elected into office. And so I don't want to miss that by any stretch of the imagination. In the case of Proposal 3, the people are the electors. The people make the law. The people are able to decide. And we really see Proposal 3 as a citizens-led initiative that's being supported by, everyone, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, because over the last 50 years, the norm and the status quo has been that access to an abortion is healthcare, and it's it's one of the basic things that everyone believes is a human right. So, there's a lot of uncertainty if Proposal 3 doesn't pass, but I just want to make sure that I underscore for everyone that this is like a real serious thing. It's not like a what if situation, and we're one of the few states that was at the ready, thanks to the work that our coalitions have done over the past several years to be prepared for this moment. And I think now it's a time for people to step in, the people of Michigan, to make sure that we are making the decision that speaks for everyone, but I think is a shared reality that the overwhelming majority of Michiganders want to see abortion remain legal in Michigan.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of social workers out there who are also concerned about what the punishment would be for health professionals, including social workers, to aid people in making those decisions. I think we have a lot of questions about, will we get a felony as well? Will we lose our license? So there's a lot of stuff that is up in the air. Do you have any guidance around that? I think this goes for more Merissa, since you're on the legal side.
Yeah, the question of your question around, was it criminalization?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that underscores that we can't look at these issues in a silo. That there are that reproductive rights, reproductive justice is at the crossroads of racial justice, of the criminal legal realm as well, and all of the ways where this is touched, and where especially pregnant people are succumb to more surveillance and scrutiny. And one of the cornerstones of reproductive freedom for all too, and the initiative and the policy is prohibiting the criminalization of pregnancy, and the criminalization of miscarriages and stillbirths and self-managed abortion, because recognizing that there's a proliferation of surveillance of pregnant people and criminalization when we see these rights rolled back in other states, and that creeps into Michigan too, even though we have protections, and that even if we pass reproductive freedom for all, I think we have to remain vigilant, because it's out there and can creep into this state. And we need to recognize that in all forms of healthcare, the danger of allowing the doors to open to government surveillance in all forms of healthcare, of allowing criminal legal system to come into healthcare as well too, and that healthcare should be private in all forms and between patients and their doctors. So I think as next steps, it's something that we'll have to stay vigilant on as well, and thankfully, like, recognizing that this is a trend that we would probably still suffer under in the state, that's included in reproductive freedom for all too.
Right. Well, thank you for clarifying that a little bit. It looks like we have another question from the chat. This one says, how are Planned Parenthood advocates and ACLU-Michigan working with other licensed professionals, such as nurses and physicians, on advocating efforts around this proposal?
Yeah, we've engaged a swath of associations and organizations of doctors, with the Committee to Protect Healthcare, and other organizations that represent doctors and nurses and medical professionals, to ensure that they are brought in and advising us on our advocacy related activities, and quite frankly, all aspects of our campaign at this point. Merissa talked about some of the coalition work that was done. And Merissa, do you want to speak to like how that coalition was formed? Who was it?
Yeah,
who was it made up of?
Yeah. In this work, we work incredibly close with the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Michigan chapter and the national chapter, and they're very much partners in this work in Lansing as well, and nationwide. And from the very beginning, during the exploration stages of this, they were engaged in recognizing that we're writing a constitutional amendment and policy, and that all stakeholders who could be touched by that need to be involved. So from the very beginning, it was the obstetricians, gynecologists, medical professionals, nurses, who were able to weigh in on the policy, so that what we were able to craft was a policy that ensured our doctors and medical professionals would have the legal protections they needed and the ability to deliver the best care possible for their patients. This was very much led by them in the formation of the policy on what do they need to be able to serve their patients and not be made victim of being pulled into this criminal legal system for providing sometimes life-saving and necessary health care for their patients too. So at every step of the way through Reproductive Freedom for All, we've been engaging those medical professionals as being the experts on the ground in the delivery of this care that's needed and being really the gatekeepers and the shepherds of this like right that we have.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I was personally wondering who else was involved as well, too. Okay. Here comes a long question from the chat. If the proposal does not pass, how would the old bill affect save fertilized eggs? Would they all have to be implanted? What other aspects of reproductive and sexual health could be potentially affected, such as birth control, IUDs, gender affirming care, etc.? It's a big one.
I think we can look at what we have seen in other states, especially since Roe was overturned. And we started to see this in other states even before Roe was overturned. But that, when the right to abortion is rolled back, when it's eliminated, you're opening the doors now for the government to scrutinize and survey all pregnant people. You've essentially eliminated that legal protection, legal cover to the privacy of your own health care throughout pregnancy. And where we've seen in other states, this has meant that there is a redefinition of what making definitions of what abortion is more and more extreme, recognizing that if you see in states that establish personhood laws, that personhood is defined at the moment of conception. So that then brings in a whole host of factors when it comes to miscarriage care, when it comes to the use of certain forms of birth control, when it comes to IVF as well. And it starts dragging in many other forms of healthcare as reproductive healthcare as well. And it has, I don't know if I want to say it's an unintended consequence of it, because I think there's probably some real intention behind it, because what we know is that anti-abortion laws are about control, and they're about control over our medical decisions. And then that reaches into other realms of reproductive healthcare. So, if reproductive freedom for all were to not pass, I mean, as Nicole said, like, we don't want to paint a dire picture. We have some options and some tools to still fight for, but it leaves us vulnerable. And it leaves us vulnerable to falling into the direction of where other states have been, where we're seeing forms of birth control being refused to being filled or banned, or repercussions for IVF treatment. We're seeing criminalization of miscarriage, more scrutiny and criminalization of miscarriages as well. And I think simply we can look at what's happening in other states to draw what the fate of Michigan would be if this weren't to pass and we were to lose our other avenues for fighting for these rights.
I mean, I also want to just give an example of real examples. And I was talking to our chief medical officer yesterday, and she was sharing a patient's story who gave us permission to share their story, that they had received, this patient came in from Wisconsin because they were forced to. Basically, abortion is not legal in Wisconsin. And this particular patient had an ectopic pregnancy. And so we know that every pregnancy is different. We know that there are medical emergencies that require an abortion. It's not just a one size fits all for anyone. And this particular patient was told to basically go home and try to find an appointment in another state when they went to receive their medical care um, in the emergency room in Wisconsin. So I'm just to underscore like what's happening in other states, that's what's happening in other states. In other states, people really don't have options, you know, in those situations where it's a medical emergency and the mother's life is at risk. Doctors are either afraid to provide the healthcare, they're afraid to provide the treatment because they're not sure whether or not they're going to be criminalized or charged with a felony or charged with a crime or have their medical license threatened or any of those things. So I think, you know, just to sort of, I mean, as we've done up until this point, which is read the tea leaves, see the writing on the wall, understand what's happening in other states and in the country, around you know what policies are being enacted. You know, in Texas they have a very extreme sort of bounty hunter law that's in place where a person will be awarded a $10,000 reward for basically you know, diming out anybody that might be getting an abortion or looking for an abortion or trying to get an abortion or maybe has provided an abortion. um so you know, there's a lot of question marks there as to what exactly will happen. You know, I don't have a crystal ball, but I can certainly look around the country to see, you know, what patients are having to go through at this point, the kinds of decisions that doctors are having to make. And you know, it's a scary time that we're living in right now. And so I just, you know, I always bring it back to the fact that here in Michigan, we have a chance to not allow that to be our state. And I think that that is really the important underscore and note that we have to make for everyone is that, you know, this is something that we have to decide on in this moment about how we're going to be governed here in Michigan. What rights do we have? And thankfully, right, we want, you know, we want to be represented. We want to represent our values when we go to the ballot box anyway. But this is a real opportunity to be able to do that because of the fact that there are some extreme laws that are in place in other states.
I I had another thought that I wanted to share, just an unintended impact of Roe being overturned that I think like paints helps paint an even more extreme picture as well. And so when Roe was overturned, what we also started to see in states was not just um, rolling back access or the rights to other forms of reproductive health care and its impact on other forms of reproductive health care. We also started to see an unintended consequence for patients being able to access healthcare that's not reproductive healthcare as well, and how it's affected access there. So we began seeing in states like Texas and some of the southern states that patients, mostly women, folks who are pregnant capable, who were receiving medication for various, oftentimes chronic illnesses, medication that they regularly take to treat chronic illnesses such as lupus, now being denied that medication that they need, that they rely on for their own health and well-being, because simply that medication may not be safe to take while someone is pregnant. And even when a patient had no intention of becoming pregnant, simply by the fact that they're capable of being pregnant and needed this medication, they are now being denied that medication that they need for their own health, and for treatment of their own chronic illnesses. So one of the common forms of medication we're seeing this for is a medication that's used to treat lupus. And we're seeing those folks who have lupus and take this medication being denied access to that medication only because of the off chance that they could become pregnant. They could take it. It could put a potential pregnancy that they don't intend to have in danger as well. So this has extreme ramifications that go far beyond abortion, far beyond other forms of reproductive health care too.
Yeah, kind of building off that, there was this question that just came from the chat. Does medical malpractice cover good faith efforts to save a person's life if there is something like that, like a ectopic pregnancy or something similar? Do you know?
I think what is so insidious and complicated about abortion laws is usually the abortion bans is usually the enforcement mechanism is criminalizing a doctor. So a doctor could, when faced with a patient who has an ectopic pregnancy, which the only form of treatment for an ectopic pregnancy is an abortion, and all ectopic pregnancies are life threatening. If they are faced with that, they could, you know, I'm sure they could try to make the claim that they were saving a patient's life. But what's so insidious about this is by that enforcement mechanism of criminalization, it is now weighing on every single doctor's decision as they're trying to treat a patient and as they're trying to make a decision of, is this patient's health so compromised that I can now provide care? Is their life so much in danger that I can provide care? Hanging over their head is the threat that they could be pulled into the criminal legal system and charged with a crime. So it creates a gray area where their ability to use their best judgment and provide the best care possible is so compromised that even if legally they could potentially make claims and put up a defense to protect themselves, they're still vulnerable, and they're still not completely safe in providing the care that they need. So that it's really that criminalization that also carries such a strong impact and makes it so difficult then to provide that care.
Yeah, it's hard when it's like this overarching shadow that's always around you and affecting every decision that you make. Another question we had from the chat: are states forming regional coalitions to support folks from states who have restricted access or rights, or is there anything that you guys have seen in your experience that is similar to this with other states supporting states that have lost access?
Yeah, I can speak for Planned Parenthood. I know that we have formed coalitions with other states and to do a couple of things, right? To do our best to protect and provide access to care for patients that need us. But also to navigate this new post-Roe environment of, what are all the implications that this is going to have? And so some of the things that have come up as it relates to the list of things that we need to solve for is the safety issue that Merissa talked about related to being charged with a crime, and how to make sure that we are working to establish and implement with our local governments and with United States governments policies, practices that support a doctor's privacy and also a patient's privacy. But the other things that may be an unintended consequence that we've had to coalesce around and really figure out are things like, abortion being legal in several states, what that means for the training of doctors who may need to be able to be trained on how to provide an abortion. That's also going to be eliminated in some of these said states. Some of the areas of digital privacy that, if we've been looking at the news, we've seen where people have been tracked online for either for their search history or someone looking at their DMs and Facebook providing that information to law enforcement in order to convict a parent and her daughter for seeking out an abortion. These are all things that are now in play, things that are unfathomable for us, but this is real life that we have to navigate. So we're really working with our interstate coalition partners to figure out what policies can we push for in Congress, the United States Congress, to make sure that our patients are safe and our doctors remain safe. but also how do we navigate this world so that, we're advocating to get us back to a place where it's a world where people can live and thrive without being criminalized for trying to make their own bodily decisions and determine their life's trajectory, and not be criminalized or targeted because of your gender and your ability to carry a child. These are all things that I've known throughout my life as basic human rights, but now we're having to fight for. So those are some of the things that we're working together with our coalition and partners on.
Okay, I think we have one or two more questions. Are there any options that you all are involved in or have heard of about restoring federal protections? I know we're kind of focused on state level stuff.
Well, I mean, certainly federal protections would include codifying the right to abortion in federal law, which is on the table. I mean, unfortunately, we haven't had a federal government where we've had the folks in power to pass this, but there are absolutely measures that can be taken to both protect that fundamental right to abortion in federal statute and also establish laws that prevent the rolling back of access in the states as well. And those have often been on the table. I think one aspect to another piece of policy that has been floating out there for a long time that we and advocates in DC have long advocated for is the repeal of the Hyde Amendment. And the Hyde Amendment is the amendment that prohibits any sort of public healthcare dollars going towards abortion care, and that includes Medicaid coverage, essentially. And really, what that is that's again another point of access that's being denied for poor people, and establishing that your right to abortion should not hinge on your ability to be able to pay for it. And it's a direct attack at a marginalized community and control over their ability to access the health care they need with the health insurance that they have. So that has long been something that we've joined in advocacy on in DC. And, I'd encourage folks to look into the Hyde Amendment and the damage it's caused and what repeal of that would mean and the doors that it would open in ensuring that everyone has more equity in this country at being able to access the right to abortion as well.
And I know the number one thing that we can do as individuals is to vote yes on Prop 3 next Tuesday. But what else can we do as an individual and as a profession overall to help in this fight for access and choice?
I appreciate sort of what you laid out, that this organization has, in essence, endorsed a yes on Proposal 3. And I think, making sure that this organization is a conduit and an advocate for your clients, your patients, the people that you serve in the world of social work, and making sure that as, these laws and policies are being developed, that you are effectively weighing in with your legislators, at every level of government at this point, because, these are intersectional issues with, social work intersects with healthcare. It is a part of the healthcare system, and it's a part of all the other systems. It's a part of the K through 12 system. It's a part of the family, supporting the family structures and systems. And so, it's very important that social workers in general weigh in, and organizations like this one really establishes a policy agenda that you guys can advocate for, that certainly ensures that we all have access to the quality of life that we deserve, and are able to thrive within our lives, and that politicians are not enacting policies that prevent a person from being able to have self-determination, from that prevent people from being able to thrive in their own life based on what they envision and see for themselves, and being able to help themselves do that.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add, Merissa?
I think only add that, like, as Nicole said, you all tapping into your power, being vocal, being advocates for this issue, recognizing that I think what we've helped to hopefully drive home for everyone is this issue doesn't happen in a silo. It has ramifications for so many aspects of our life. When we lose the ability to make our own decisions about our pregnancies, and that we're in this position that we're in right now because abortion was so easily able to be marginalized and stigmatized from other forms of medical care, and that there weren't enough voices rising up and like saying this is wrong over the last 50 years, that we, I think, took these rights for granted a bit, and that in order to for long lasting protection and to continue to advocate, it's going to still need to remain all hands on deck, being vocal and advocating in all spaces where these rights remain under attack, so that we can, stay vigilant and make sure that we're making progress from here on out and not continuing to lose these rights, because it'll chip away in so many other facets of our life now that this door has been opened.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both again. I want to give you the last few minutes if you have any last comments or summaries for all of us social workers out here.
I think just thank you so much for having us. Appreciate what you all do. Someone who works in Lansing quite a bit, I love your organization and the partnership on so many of the issues that the ACLU works on. So thank you for thinking of having us on this.
Yeah, I just want to echo Marissa's thanks. I worked in child welfare for many years, and I consider myself to be an honorary social worker. Many of my closest friends are actually social workers, and the way in which social workers are on the front lines for people is to be commended. And I think I can't overstate, there's no way I could overstate the importance of the work that you all do. And so the fact that you have this policy agenda and you have a committee that's really working to advocate for social workers, right? And for the work that you all do is incredible. And I also want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for that, because it helps us all when we all work together to ensure that people have access to the quality of life that they deserve.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. And I think Danielle's going to come back on for some announcements.
Yes, thank you, Nicole and Merissa, for the important work that you do every day. We are grateful for your partnership and that important work. And thank you to Melina for her great moderating.